Late one afternoon in December of 1986, a woman named Shanti Singh was sitting on her bed cradling her toddler son, whose name was T2, as he threw a huge temper tantrum. T2, who was 3 years old, had already been throwing this tantrum for about 30 minutes at this point, and it didn't seem like anything Shanti did was getting him to calm down. In fact, honestly, it just seemed like T2 was getting worse and worse by the second. And Shanti knew her son's constant wailing must be annoying her neighbors in the little rural village in northern India where they lived. But again, Shanti just felt like really there was nothing she could do. After all, this was not a typical toddler tantrum. T2 was not throwing this tantrum because he lost a toy or was fighting with his siblings or something. No, the reality was Shanti and her husband had no idea why T2 was throwing this tantrum, because T2 threw these tantrums all the time for seemingly no reason, and nothing they did would get him to stop. He would just start throwing these crazy fits, and he would only stop when he was ready. Now, Shanti and her husband had taken T2 to the local doctor, and he'd been examined, and the doctor said, look, I think your son's just fine. I can't find anything wrong with him. So whatever's causing him to be so upset, it's got to be psychological. Shanti grabbed her son and tried to give him a hug and kiss to get him to calm down. But as she did that, T2 turned around and tried to hit her in the face and kicked her and punched her. And so Shanti had to kind of fall back on the bed. And T2 at this point, who's still throwing this huge tantrum, he leapt off the bed and ran out of the room. Now, Shanti had already sent the rest of her family, her kids, her husband, outside to wait out this current T2 tantrum. And so for a second, Shanti thought about just laying on the bed and letting her crazy toddler just kind of run around the house until he was done throwing this tantrum. But as Shanti was laying there on the bed, practically crying from frustration, she heard a plate break in the kitchen. And so she jumped up and ran into the kitchen, and there was T2 looking down at the ground where there was a shattered plate on the ground. Clearly, T2 had smashed it on purpose. And so as furious as Shanti was, she suddenly realized that, nothing she could do was going to get this kid to stop. And so right now, the only thing she could do was just put him in a safe place where he couldn't hurt other people or himself or damage anything else. And so Shanti, trying to be as calm as possible, walked up to T2, who's still throwing this tantrum and swinging at her as she's coming near him. And she grabbed him, she turned him around so he couldn't kick her or punch her. She put him into his room and then shut the door. And then she sat down in the hallway with her back up against the door to keep it shut. And then as T2 inside the room began banging on the door and trying to open it, Shanti's sitting there anchoring the door, and she's just praying that her son's gonna calm down soon. And then at some point, Shanti heard her son start to say something that typically signaled the end of a tantrum. T2 in the bedroom began saying the word Shursh Verma, which actually was a nonsense word that Shanti and her husband and the other kids had no idea what it meant. But, T2, at the end of his tantrums, he would always just start saying over and over again, Shursh Verma, Shursh Verma, Shursh Verma. And so Shanti, she's in the hall and she's hearing T2 start to do that. And so on the one hand, she's thinking, okay, this tantrum's about to end. But on the other, she's like, I have no idea what that word means. It's obviously connected in some way to what's going on with my son, but I have no idea what it means. It sounds like nonsense. And so Shanti began yelling through the door at T2 to explain what Shursh Verma meant, but T2 had no explanation. He just kept saying the word over and over again. Shursh Verma, Shursh Verma, Shursh Verma. Shanti and her husband had 5 other kids. T2 was the youngest, and T2 was not like any of his other siblings. The other siblings did not throw temper tantrums like this, not at all. And in fact, T2 had been a difficult child even before he was born. Towards the end of Shanti's pregnancy with T2, she'd become very, very sick, and in fact had to be hospitalized for the entire last trimester. And then as a newborn baby, T2 basically didn't sleep at all, and he cried constantly. And so Shanti and her husband initially thought, T2 must just be a very fussy baby. But in time, as he grew into more of a toddler, it was clear to Shanti and her husband that T2 was actually a different kind of kid. He seemed like a very unhappy and kind of angry kid who was permanently on the verge of crying or throwing a fit. But it wasn't until T2 began talking at around 2 years old that Shanti and her husband really started to become worried. Because the things T2 was saying as a 2-year-old were just not in keeping with what you would expect a 2-year-old to say. And I'm not talking about the nonsense word that T2 would use during his temper tantrums, Shursh Verma. Basically, T2 would say things that seemed to indicate that he genuinely hated everyone in his family. Now, for context, Shanti and her family were not poor, but they weren't rich either. They lived in a little concrete home, they didn't have a TV or a car, and all the kids wore hand-me-down clothes, and Shanti actually handmade her clothes and her husband's clothes. But the family always had enough food to eat, and they were educated, and they seemed happy enough. It's just that they didn't really have the ability to do anything extra, like above and beyond a modest life. And Titu had never known anything different. This was his life from the day he was born. But when he learned to speak at around 2 years old, it was like all Titu wanted to talk about was how crappy of a lifestyle their family lived. For example, when Titu's mom, Shanti, would put on one of her saris that happened to be ripped, a sari is a traditional garment in India, Titu would look at what she was wearing, and in toddler speak, he would tell her that she looked terrible and that it looked like she was just wearing rags. Titu would also walk around their house and he would point to spots in the house that looked dirty, and he would demand that somebody cleaned it up because he didn't want to live in a dirty house. And then whenever the family needed to go somewhere and they would walk there or take the bus there, Titu would complain the entire time that he wanted to be in a car, and why aren't we driving in a car? Like, why are we walking? Despite the fact that Titu basically had never used a car before. But perhaps the strangest aspect of Titu's behavior was around the time he began talking and insulting his family, he also began talking about this very historic city called Agra, which was located about 8 miles away from where they lived. Agra was famous for being home to the Taj Mahal, which is considered to be one of the most beautiful buildings ever made. Agra also has a very busy downtown and lots of tourism, but Titu had never been to Agra, and there was no reason he would be drawn to Agra, like his family had no connection to that city. But starting around the time Titu began talking at 2 years old, he began asking to go to Agra several times a week. And when his parents would say, no, we're not going to go to Agra, Titu would throw a huge tantrum. And so not long after Titu had begun speaking and saying all these terrible things, Shanti and her husband decided that really all they could do was just wait and hope their son grew out of this terrible behavior. But Titu did not grow out of this. Shortly after his parents decided to just kind of wait it out, Titu would randomly attack another small child with a sugarcane, and he beat the kid so badly the kid was bleeding at the end of the attack. And then also another time, shortly after the sugarcane beating, Titu was at the store with his mother, and his mom was looking at this bracelet, which she couldn't afford. She was just looking at it through the glass, and Titu sensed his mom wanted the bracelet, and in an odd show of affection for his mother, he turned to the shopkeeper, this little tiny kid who's not even 3 years old yet, and he tells the shopkeeper that if he doesn't give this bracelet to his mother for free, that Titu will shoot and kill the shopkeeper. And so after this, Shanti and her husband just stopped taking Titu out in public at all. It was just too embarrassing. But what really just unsettled Shanti the most about her son's behavior was that nonsense word that Titu kept saying at the end of all of his tantrums, Shursh Verma, Shursh Verma. And so fast forward to that day after he's broken the plate and now Shanti's put him in his room, Titu began saying that nonsense word, except he was getting a little bit older and his speech was getting a little bit more clear. And so as Shanti was laying up against the door, she realized that her son was not saying a single word, Shursh Verma, he was saying 2 words. They were Suresh Varma. But Shanti had no idea what that meant. She thought it sounded like a name, but it was a name she had never heard before. But one day, a few months after the dish-breaking incident, in April of 1987, all of Titu's very strange, erratic, terrible behaviors would erupt all at once. That April day started out like any other. Shanti made breakfast for her family, and then her husband headed out to do some errands, and her 6 children kind of dispersed around the inside and outside of the house to play, study, whatever. But Titu was really grouchy, and so he stayed inside in the kitchen with Shanti. A little while later, Shanti's oldest son came into the kitchen and he asked his mother, hey, when will Dad get back from his trip to Agra? Shanti's husband had gone to Agra to run one of his chores, and Agra was the city that Titu was totally obsessed with. And so when Shanti's oldest son said the word Agra, T2, who was sitting in the kitchen, he heard it and kind of looked up like he was totally fixated on their conversation. And then as Shanti and her oldest were talking about the dad, T2 just got up, left the kitchen, and he went to his room. He grabbed a couple of things, and then he came back into the kitchen carrying this bundle of clothes with him. And he walked right past his brother and his mother. He went out the front door and began running down the road without saying a word. Remember, this is like a 3-year-old child. This is not a teenager. This is a little kid. And so Shanti and her oldest son, they kind of watched in shock as T2 ran off down the road. And for a minute, neither of them did anything. And then it was like they broke out of their trance, and the oldest son just turned and began running out of the house to catch up with T2. Now, it didn't take long for the oldest to catch up with his young brother, but it was surprisingly hard to stop T2 from trying to run away. He fought back as hard as he could to keep his brother from pulling him back to the house. And then when the older brother got T2 back inside, Shanti looked at her older son and she saw he had a black eye from where T2 had just hit him. And when Shanti turned to T2 to try to get him to apologize to his brother for hitting him, she saw T2 was completely inconsolable. He was throwing a huge temper tantrum. He was on the ground kicking and flailing and screaming at the top of his lungs. And so Shanti and her oldest son knew there was no hope in getting him to calm down. He was deep into one of his tantrums. And so Shanti and the oldest just basically restrained T2 so he couldn't hurt himself or one of them or damage anything. And for a while, as they held him to the ground, T2 just continued to scream and flail and throw this fit. But eventually he did kind of calm down and he began saying Suresh Verma over and over again. But then he began talking about something that he really hadn't brought up before that stood out to Shanti and her oldest son. T2, in addition to saying periodically Suresh Verma, also began talking about some radio store in Agra. And T2 kept saying, why didn't Dad bring me to the radio store? Why didn't he bring me? And so as Shanti is listening to her son, she suddenly thinks, you know what? This is my chance. He's being so specific about this radio store. Maybe this is my opportunity to lean in and learn what the heck is going on with my kid. And so once T2 fully stopped his temper tantrum and Shanti and her oldest could finally let go of him, once T2 had left the room, Shanti turned to her oldest son and she told him to go to Agra right now. Just go there and look for a radio store or something. Look for anything that could be a clue to what's going on with T2. He obviously has some fixation with the city. Just go, look around, see if you can find something. So the oldest son left the house and he went to one of his friends' houses who had a car, and together they drove into Agra. Now, Shanti had no idea if her oldest son's trip to Agra would produce anything useful, but she figured, she's got nothing to lose. A few hours later, when Shanti's oldest son returned from Agra, he came into their home with a very serious look on his face. And right away, Shanti could tell, clearly, he's discovered something. And so Shanti asked her oldest son, tell me, what did you learn? What happened in Agra? And the oldest son, he looked down for a second, and then he looked back at his mom and he just said, tomorrow, we're going to have visitors. The next day, a car pulled up in front of Shanti's home and 6 people climbed out. There was a woman wearing a beautiful red sari who appeared to be in her 30s, and then there were 3 other men who also appeared to be in their 30s, and they were all wearing suits and jackets. And there was also an older couple, a man and a woman, and the man was wearing this beautiful sweater, and the woman had on all this silk. It was clear, just from the way they looked, that these 6 people were not from this area. They were from somewhere else, and they had a ton of money. Now, Shanti was inside the house and she was watching this group arrive, but she did not go outside to greet them. She, her husband, and all of her kids, minus T2, had decided the night before, when they knew these visitors were going to arrive, that they wouldn't go out and talk to them. Instead, they would just allow T2 to basically make first contact with these people and see what happens. So when Shanti saw this group of 6 very well-off people were standing right outside of their gate, kind of waiting to be let in, she called for T2 and said, hey, go outside and open the gate for our guests. And so T2, who was not throwing a fit at this point, he came running through the house and he went to the door. He's not looked outside yet. He opens up the door and he runs outside and he sees these 6 people on the other side of the gate. And suddenly Shanti heard T2 make a sound that he never made. It was like the sound of pure joy. He was so elated to see these 6 people. Shanti couldn't believe it. For a second, Shanti closed her eyes and almost started crying because she knew, even before Titu had made that joyous sound when he saw these people, they were about to solve the mystery of what was going on with her son. Just then, Shanti heard Titu from outside yelling for Shanti and the rest of his family to come outside and meet his other family. Shanti went to the door and gestured for the guests to come inside, and then she led them through the house to the back deck. And then after they were all seated, Shanti looked over at her son, Titu, and she saw he had this huge grin on his face. He was so happy, and he was staring intently at the woman who got out of the car, who was in her 30s and wearing the beautiful red sari, and she was sitting right across the table from Titu, and Titu is just locked on her. Now, at this point, nobody is speaking. Everybody is just sitting there. No introductions have been made, so nobody even knows each other's names. And in this kind of tense and awkward silence, Titu, who again is just staring at this woman in red, he eventually breaks the silence, the 3-year-old child, and he asks the woman in red to come sit next to him. And so the woman in the red sari, she does what he asks and moves over and sits next to the toddler. And then Titu looked up at her and he smiled and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And the woman, she's looking down at him and she said, "No, I don't." And Titu would look back up at her and he would say, "I know who you are. You're Uma." And at this, the woman in red, whose name really was Uma, she gasped. She had no idea how this kid knew who she was. But before she could even say anything, Titu continued. And he said to her, "Hey, do you remember when we went to the fair with Ranu and Sanu and I bought you those sweets?" And at this, the woman in the red sari, Uma, she had this new look come over her face. Instead of looking like she was just kind of shocked and appalled that this random kid knew who she was, now it was like a look of shocked recognition as she's looking down at Titu, like she suddenly understood what was actually going on. And at the same time, Titu's mother, Shanti, was watching this happen, and she was kind of piecing together what was really going on here, and suddenly she realized she needed to check something. And she got up and she ran out of the room and she came back with scissors. And without saying anything, Shanti went straight to Titu, she pushed his head to the side, exposing his right ear, and she used those scissors and began cutting all the hair off his head that was kind of drooped over his right ear, kind of exposing the right side of his skull. And as the hair on Titu's head fell to the ground, exposing more and more of the right side of his head, all the adults watching just gasped. And the whole time, Titu was just smiling. To understand what just happened out on that back porch between these random people and Shanti and her family, you need some context. So here's what happened when Shanti's oldest son was sent to Agra to go investigate and look for clues that could explain what was going on with Titu. The brother and his friend had driven all around Agra, looking for radio stores and looking for things that might in some way kind of connect to Titu, and they didn't see anything. But at some point, they drove past one of the many radio stores in Agra, and the name of this radio store immediately stood out to the brother and this friend. So the older brother and the friend, they parked their car and they went into this particular radio shop, and inside of there is where they met Uma, the woman who had the red sari on, who was in her 30s, that Titu said we went to the fair together with, that woman. So she's inside this radio shop, and when the older brother asked Uma how this radio shop got its name, that was when things began to fall into place for this older brother about what was going on with Titu. Uma would tell the older brother that this radio shop actually belonged to her husband, except 3.5 years ago, he was murdered. He was shot and killed, and so she had been running the shop ever since. And Uma said she had considered changing the name of the shop, since taking it over, but she just couldn't bring herself to change it because the shop's name was actually based on her husband's name. The name of the shop was Suresh Radio Shop. Her husband's name was Suresh Verma, the 2 words that Titu would say all the time at the end of his tantrums. Suresh Verma, Suresh Verma. That was Uma's husband. And it would turn out the details of Suresh's death matched up in a very bizarre way with Titu's birth. And all of Titu's totally erratic, strange, terrible behavior throughout really his entire life to this point now suddenly made sense if you knew about Suresh's life. Many people, including professors from major universities in India and America, have come to believe that what happened with Titu was when Suresh was murdered, his spirit somehow came out of his body and entered Titu's body. Basically, Suresh was reincarnated in Titu. This reincarnation theory would explain why T2 was always saying Suresh Verma, because in theory that was his real name. That's the guy who died, who then his spirit transitioned to T2, so he's saying his name over and over again. And then also T2's obsession with Agra would make sense, because that's where Suresh's radio shop was and where he lived. Also, the reincarnation theory would explain why T2 was so critical of Shanti and the rest of his family's lifestyle, basically accusing them of being poor and kind of living below his station. Well, Suresh's family was very, very wealthy, and so that was the lifestyle Suresh had lived. And so if his spirit was now in T2's body, he might be at odds with their lifestyle. And lastly, the reincarnation theory would explain the two very unique and very pronounced birthmarks that T2 had right next to his right ear. He had one right above his right ear and right below it. Now, these were birthmarks that Shanti was well aware of, but after she learned about how Suresh Verma was killed, he was shot in the side of his head, and the bullet went in above his right ear and then came out on the bottom part of his right ear, right here. When she heard that, she ran and got the scissors. She cut the hair away around T2's ear, revealing the two birthmarks. And then the other families saw those birthmarks, and they're like, oh my goodness, that is literally where the entry and exit wounds were on Suresh. And then also, it's worth pointing out that on the day Suresh was shot and killed, well, basically that day was when T2's mother, Shanti, began feeling really sick during her pregnancy with T2, and she had to be hospitalized. After this discovery about T2 and Suresh Verma, Shanti and her husband and the rest of her family expected T2 to want to live with Uma and his other family. And at first, that is what T2 wanted to do, but pretty quickly he actually decided that, you know what, I want to stay put with the family I was born into, and we can just visit with the other family. And so that's what they did. Uma and the other wealthy family, they made visits all the time to see T2 and vice versa. The families got along great. And as for T2, he was really happy. His bad behavior basically went away and he became a normal, high-functioning kid. And T2 has grown up and become a very happy and successful adult. He's got a family of his own, and he's currently a professor at a college in India. On the night of Thursday, June 5th, 1980, 25-year-old Karen Strom pulled her yellow Camaro into the front driveway of her two-story house in Woods Cross, Utah, a small suburb of Salt Lake City. Karen and her husband Steve stepped out and approached the house, which was yellow like the car. And that was not a coincidence. Karen just really loved yellow, and Steve had been more than happy to go along with her when they bought the place. The two of them had just come from dinner, and when they were all dressed up for a night out, some people found it hard to believe that Karen and Steve were just this average couple who lived in a small Utah suburb. Instead, they thought the pair looked more like a Hollywood couple. Karen had long blonde hair and light eyes, and she always looked right at home behind the wheel of her sleek sports car. Steve was tall with red hair and a red beard, and whenever they had their photo taken together, it was like they knew exactly how to pose. However, despite what some people thought about them based on their good looks, those who actually knew Karen and Steve understood that they were just like most young people in the area. They worked hard at their jobs, they talked about starting a family one day, and they loved living in the safe, secluded neighborhood not far from the beautiful Wasatch Mountains. Karen and Steve headed inside the house, and Karen turned on the TV, and then both of them sat down on the couch to watch. But while Karen leaned back and got comfortable, Steve couldn't seem to settle down. They'd gone out to dinner to celebrate both Steve's 27th birthday and also their 7th anniversary. Now, Karen was ready to relax for the rest of the night, but she knew Steve couldn't really do that, because he still had to go to work that night. He had a late shift at a local factory that went all the way until 7:30 the following morning. So, as Karen sat there, Steve tried to sit for a little while, but then just began getting up and collecting things he would need for work, and then he would come back to the couch, but would be anxious and get up again and get something else that he would need for work. Now, Karen knew that Steve would much rather finish the birthday and anniversary celebration at home with her than go to the factory. But the truth was, Karen actually couldn't wait for Steve to go to work. Because even though she'd gone out with Steve to celebrate and she was now laughing and chatting with him on the couch, in reality, Karen didn't want to even be in the house with her husband anymore, and she'd felt this way for months. Karen and Steve had been high school sweethearts, so they'd been together since they were teenagers. Back in school, Karen had been outgoing and extremely popular, while Steve had always been quiet and a bit shy. But when they'd met at school, they'd gotten along right away, and they had fallen in love fast. So in 1973, not long after they graduated from high school, they got married. And then they moved into a small apartment together and began their lives together. And for a time, the marriage had been everything Karen had dreamed of. She and Steve weren't rich by any means, but they were smart with their money, and they had eventually saved up enough to move out of their first small apartment and buy the yellow house that Karen had loved so much. And back then, the two of them had seemed like partners in everything. They had the same goals, and they truly supported each other. But the longer they stayed together, the more Karen had begun to see a side of Steve that was nothing like the reserved, caring man she fell in love with. Because Steve had begun drinking a lot. In fact, there were some nights when Steve and Karen would go out with a couple they were friends with, and Steve would get so drunk that Karen and the other couple would have to literally carry him out to the car. And then they'd have to carry him from the car to his bed when they got back to the house. But as much as that upset Karen, she didn't even consider those nights to be the worst nights. Because sometimes when Steve drank, he didn't just get sloppy, he got angry and aggressive. And when Karen's sister and friends had started to worry that Steve might be getting violent with her, Karen would defend Steve, saying he was a good guy who just had some bad nights sometimes. But finally, about 3 months before their 7th wedding anniversary, Karen couldn't take Steve's heavy drinking and mood swings anymore, and she'd made what she considered to be the hardest decision of her life. She told Steve that she wanted a divorce, and she'd started spending most nights at her stepmom's house. Even though they were now separated, Karen still went out with Steve sometimes. She still came by the house to see him, and she would even sleep there with him some nights. She knew Steve hoped that meant they could maybe patch things up, but in reality, she just didn't see any hope for their marriage anymore. Back at the house, Karen continued to watch TV, anxiously waiting for the moment when she could be alone and go to sleep by herself in her old bed. And a little after midnight on June 6th, Steve finally said it was time for him to go to work. So, Karen got off the couch, walked with him to the front door, and Steve gave her a kiss. Karen told him to have a good night at work. She said she was going right to bed, and she would see him in the morning when he got home. And once Steve was gone, Karen did head right down the hallway to the bedroom, changed out of her clothes, and climbed into bed. However, she had so many things running through her mind that she couldn't sleep. As upset as she was about Steve's alcohol issues and her crumbling marriage as a result of those issues, this relationship was basically all she'd known since she was a kid. And part of her did still really love Steve. She knew that was why she had not been able to fully walk away yet. But as she lay in bed, Karen felt sure that even if leaving Steve for good would be challenging, it was something she just had to do. And she just had to finally make a clean break and stop staying at this house altogether. She had to start living her own life somewhere else. About 8 hours later, around 7:30 a.m. on June 6, 1980, Steve unlocked the front door of the yellow house, walked inside, and headed right to the bedroom. Steve felt exhausted from his overnight shift, and he couldn't wait to get some sleep. He'd called Karen before he left work, but she hadn't answered, and he'd seen her yellow Camaro still parked out front, so he figured she just hadn't woken up yet. However, when he opened the bedroom door, he froze right there in the doorway. The room was completely trashed. The small TV had been knocked off its stand, one of the bedside tables had been pushed over, and the bed's brass headboard was broken. Then Steve looked down at the floor, and he began to scream, because there, on the ground, sticking out behind the bed, was Karen's feet. Steve ran into the room hysterical, shouting Karen's name, but when he got to her, he saw that she was totally motionless, just laying there in a t-shirt and her underwear. He crouched down and tried to get her to wake up, but he could tell very quickly that she must be dead. Steve stood up and the room felt like it was spinning. He stumbled outside, made his way to the phone in the kitchen, and dialed 911. Later that morning, Detective Clarence Montgomery of the Woods Cross Police walked towards Karen and Steve's front door. He was responding to a call that had come into the station that said a young woman, Karen Strom, had been found unresponsive inside of her home. As he approached the door, Detective Montgomery saw a uniformed officer standing in the front yard, along with a red-haired man who had his face buried in his hands. Montgomery walked past the red-haired man and the uniformed officer and walked into the house. There, he connected with another uniformed officer who'd arrived first at the scene, who would tell Montgomery that Karen was deceased. And then he led him down the hallway to the bedroom. At the threshold of the bedroom, Montgomery slipped on a pair of gloves. Then he walked inside, and right away he noticed the TV on the floor and the broken bed. Then he walked around the bed and crouched down over Karen's body, and he saw there were deep purple bruises on her neck and throat. And Montgomery just couldn't believe it, because he figured that these bruises were a clear sign that Karen had been murdered, strangled to death. But Woods Cross, Utah, where Montgomery had worked as a cop for a decade, was a very safe and quiet town. And in the 45 years since the town had been founded, there had literally never been a reported homicide. Montgomery stood up and told the other officer to radio in for a forensics team. While Montgomery waited on the forensics team, the other police officer, the one who was first on the scene, radioed the station to have them inform the medical examiner's office about the case, and then that officer left to go contact Karen's family to tell them about her death. So while that was happening, and while Montgomery was just waiting, he just did a complete sweep of the bedroom on his own. Now, despite having never handled a homicide case before, Montgomery knew instinctively that for the room to look like this, to be in complete disarray, could indicate that perhaps a robber was here and had ransacked the place, in addition to, killing Karen. However, after doing the sweep of the bedroom, Montgomery did not come to that conclusion. Instead, he believed someone had come into this bedroom with the sole intent to kill Karen. And the broken bed and the TV on the floor meant one thing. Karen had put up a real fight for her life. So Montgomery went back to Karen's body, and what he saw now seemed to support his theory. The detective found scratches on Karen's arms that looked like defensive wounds, and he also saw that parts of her fingernails had broken off. Not long after Montgomery had fully searched the room, the small forensics team arrived and they did the same thing. And they came to the same conclusion that Montgomery had, that very likely this was a targeted attack on Karen and that Karen had fought back really aggressively. And so they thought that if that was the case, very likely her attacker then had physical marks left on them from Karen. The forensics team dusted the room and the entire house for fingerprints. They also clipped parts of Karen's fingernails and took blood samples from her clothes to save as evidence for possible testing at the crime lab. So in 1980, DNA testing was still in its earliest phase, and it would be years before police departments would use it in investigations. Still, forensic technicians were aware that advances in investigatory technology could happen fast, so they would often collect evidence that they knew they couldn't really test yet, in the hope that maybe at some point in the future, if a crime remained unsolved, new technology and testing would make that evidence viable. As the forensics team continued their work in the house, Detective Montgomery headed outside to speak to the red-haired man he'd seen when he first arrived. The man Montgomery now knew was Karen's husband, Steve. Montgomery could immediately see that Steve was a mess. He was sobbing and looked like he was struggling to catch his breath. Montgomery honestly felt bad for him. However, in a case like this, the spouse was the first suspect. So, after approaching Steve and introducing himself, he began by asking him where he'd been that morning and also where he'd been the night before. Through tears, Steve told Montgomery about his and Karen's dinner, how he'd left her to go to work at the factory around midnight, and that he'd gotten back home around 7:30 that morning. Steve said he'd unlocked the front door, gone right to the bedroom, and found Karen. As Montgomery heard this, he immediately focused on the part where Steve said he unlocked the front door, because Montgomery had not found any evidence of forced entry into the house. But if Steve was telling the truth about the door being locked when he got home, Montgomery thought whoever attacked Karen had to have a key. Or it had to have been someone Karen would open the door for late at night. But before Montgomery could question Steve further, he heard the sound of a car screeching to a halt right outside the house. The detective looked up, saw the car door fly open, and watched as a young woman who was maybe 20 years old marched towards him. And this young woman pointed right at Steve and shouted, "He finally did it! He killed her!" Steve stammered, and Montgomery rushed over to the young woman, trying to keep the situation from getting out of hand. Montgomery tried to calm this young woman down, but it clearly was not working. She said that she was Karen's little sister, Coco, and she'd rushed over as soon as she had gotten the news about her sister's death. And she said again that she was sure Steve had killed her. However, as Montgomery was trying to keep Coco separated from Steve, something happened that made Coco break down even more. The front door of the house opened, and members of the medical examiner's staff wheeled Karen out in a black body bag. And Coco saw it and just crumbled. She started sobbing uncontrollably, and then she told them not to do that, not to take Karen away. Everything about this was new for Detective Montgomery. He'd never dealt with a murder case, and he already felt like the situation at the house was spiraling totally out of control. He knew he needed to act fast before things got worse, so he called an officer over to stay with Karen's sister and to make sure she was okay. He had no idea if there was any truth to the accusations Coco had thrown at Steve, or if it was just how she was dealing with her anger, shock, and grief. But that didn't matter right now. Montgomery marched back across the yard and told Steve they needed to talk down at the station right now. Not long after that, Detective Montgomery led Steve into a small office at the police station. And once they were sitting down, it was clear Steve was still visibly shaken. Montgomery asked him a few basic questions about his and Karen's marriage. He wanted to know if they'd been fighting or had been experiencing any financial problems, anything like that. Steve admitted that he and Karen had hit a rough patch recently, but he said they were working things out. They'd been in love since they were teenagers, and they were both committed to trying to make the marriage work. He said they'd just gone out the night before to celebrate their anniversary, and then Steve said again that after that he'd gone to work right around midnight, and he said everything seemed fine, and that Karen had told him she would see him in the morning. As Steve spoke, Montgomery made a note of Steve's work schedule. Then he asked if there was anyone other than family that Karen might open the door for late at night. Steve nodded and gave Montgomery a list of some of their closest friends. After that, the two men talked for a bit longer, and then eventually Montgomery told Steve he could leave for now. However, the police would soon follow up. After Steve left, Montgomery sat alone for a while, thinking through Steve's story. It'd be easy enough to follow up on his work alibi at the factory, but right now, Montgomery had no idea of Karen's actual time of death. For all he knew, Steve was her killer, and maybe he killed her before he even went to work, and everything he said about discovering Karen's body could just be a complete lie. However, for the time being, he had no evidence pointing directly at Steve, or really anybody else. So, he looked down at the list of friends that Steve had just given him, and he saw one name that might help him verify Steve's alibi and allow him to learn more about Steve and Karen's marriage all at once. The man's name was Ed Owens, and he was Steve's coworker and one of the couple's friends. Late in the afternoon on June 6th, so several hours after Karen's body had been discovered, Detective Montgomery sat down with Ed Owens in an office at a factory in town. Ed sat there in silence for a minute, with a stunned look on his face. He couldn't believe the news Montgomery had just given him about Karen's murder. He said it didn't make sense. People loved Karen. She was beautiful and kind and caring. Montgomery acknowledged that, but he stayed on task, and he asked Ed if he'd seen Steve the night before. Ed told him that they had briefly crossed paths at the factory, but he and Steve had worked different shifts, so they didn't really talk or anything. Then, Montgomery asked about Steve and Karen's relationship. And at this, Ed began to shift a little and got an uncomfortable look on his face. Eventually, he said that he and his wife were good friends with Steve and Karen, and they would go out together, and usually things were great. But sometimes, Steve would drink really heavily to the point where they would have to literally carry him out to the car and even carry him up to his bed on occasion. But Ed was quick to say that despite his alcoholism, Steve loved Karen more than anyone, and that Steve really was a good guy. After Montgomery finished with the interview, he tracked down Steve's manager, who did have a record of Steve clocking in and clocking out at the times he had said. And also, several other employees vouched that Steve had worked the late shift. But again, this didn't really prove anything to Montgomery. He needed to know a time of death to know if Steve showing up for work really was an alibi or not. Like, he could have killed her before he showed up for work. Over the next couple of days, Detective Montgomery and his small investigative team interviewed Karen's friends, family, and coworkers. And a pattern quickly started to emerge. Almost all of them said similar things to what Karen's sister Coco had told police. They had worried about what Steve might do to Karen after he'd been drinking. And some of them said they'd even seen bruises on Karen that clearly she had tried to cover up. This felt like a big discovery to Detective Montgomery. If he could prove that Steve had a history of violence towards his wife, well, he could then connect that to the violent attack that led to Karen's death. And in addition to that, Karen's friends all said something else that also made Steve look bad. They told Montgomery that no matter what Steve said about the marriage, Karen had genuinely been ready to end the marriage. In fact, they told Montgomery that Karen hadn't just brought up divorce and gone to stay with her stepmom. She'd actually started dating somebody else, a car mechanic whose name was Buff Bangetter, and Steve knew all about it. This immediately made Montgomery start to rethink his whole case, or at least it made him consider other possibilities. He'd been so focused on Steve because he believed that Karen's decision to move out of the house could have potentially pushed Steve over the edge and led to him attacking and killing her in a moment of rage. And also, finding out about Karen's new boyfriend could definitely have made Steve even angrier. But now, Montgomery also wondered if the man Karen had started dating, Buff, might have gotten jealous that Karen still spent time and even still spent the night occasionally with her husband Steve. And so maybe if that was the case, Buff could have potentially shown up to the house late at night to confront her, and there was a good chance Karen would have opened the door for him and let him inside. So now it was clear that Montgomery had a potentially angry and jealous husband and a potentially angry and jealous boyfriend. On June 8th, so 2 days after Karen's body had been found in her room, Detective Montgomery sat down with the man Karen had started dating before she died, Buff Bangetter. Buff was cordial and cooperative right from the start. He said he was 35 years old, so about 10 years older than Karen, but he said the age gap really hadn't mattered. He said the two of them had hit it off soon after they had met a couple of months earlier. They both loved cars, and they both dreamed of starting a family someday, and they both desperately wanted to be in a healthy relationship that was built on kindness and mutual respect. Buff also said that he knew all about Karen's relationship with her husband Steve, and he never did anything to stand in the way of it. In fact, he said he didn't have any issue at all with Karen spending time at the house and even staying with Steve overnight. He knew they'd been together a long time and they were still married, so Buff said the last thing he wanted to do was get in the way if there was a chance that maybe Karen and Steve could save their marriage. As Buff said all this, Montgomery got the impression that Buff was truly heartbroken about Karen's death, like he did not come off as if he was lying. Still, that didn't mean he was innocent. After all, Buff's alibi was pretty weak. He said on the night that Karen got murdered, he'd been at home by himself. After their talk, Detective Montgomery let Buff go. He wasn't going to cross Buff off his suspect list by any means, but the interview with Buff didn't do much to change Montgomery's mind about Steve. He believed there were just too many factors that still made Steve the most likely killer. Now, Montgomery just needed some piece of hard evidence that would help him cement that theory. The next day, June 9th, so 3 days into the investigation, Detective Montgomery sat at his desk, reading over the autopsy report that he'd been waiting for. The medical examiner had determined that while there were clear signs of a physical altercation before death, there was no indication of sexual assault. He also stated that the cause of death was indeed strangulation. Now, this did not surprise Montgomery. It had seemed clear to him that Karen had been strangled from the moment he saw her body. But as Montgomery continued to read, he saw there was a note from the medical examiner that made him feel like suddenly everything was falling into place. Because the autopsy report stated that Karen's time of death could have been anywhere between 10 p.m. on June 5th and 2 a.m. on June 6th, which meant that Karen's husband Steve, who did have an alibi for being at work just after midnight, could have, based on timeline, killed her in the couple of hours before he left. And so Detective Montgomery stood up at his desk and sprung into action. He sent officers out to go get Steve and bring him back to the station. Later that afternoon, Montgomery was once again sitting across from Steve. But this time, Steve wasn't crying and trying to catch his breath. Instead, he just had an angry and annoyed look on his face. And Steve didn't waste any time. He told Montgomery that everything he'd said in their first meeting was the truth. Karen had been fine the last time he saw her. He also said he loved his wife and would never hurt her. Then, Steve did something that took Montgomery completely by surprise. Steve leaned in across the table and literally demanded that the police give him a polygraph test right now. Now, even highly cooperative suspects do not volunteer to take polygraphs before the police have even mentioned it. But Montgomery said he'd be happy to accommodate Steve's wishes. So, a little later that afternoon, officers hooked Steve up to the polygraph machine and asked him a series of questions pertaining to his relationship with Karen and to his whereabouts on the night of June 5th and the morning of June 6th. And when the results quickly came back, it showed that Steve had failed. Going over those results, Detective Montgomery was now absolutely convinced Steve was the killer. However, he knew polygraph tests were not admissible evidence in court, so he had to find something more tangible if he wanted to put together a case that the district attorney would be willing to take on. So again, Montgomery had to let Steve go. And this really frustrated him, because Montgomery was feeling an enormous amount of pressure to solve this case. He wanted to get justice for Karen and her family, but he also knew that since this was the first murder case in the community, he was now setting a precedent. And he wanted to prove that the people of Woods Cross could trust their police force to get the job done. Throughout the end of June and all of July, Detective Montgomery and his team dug deep into every aspect of Steve and Karen's lives. The forensics unit had found Steve's fingerprints all over the crime scene, but of course that didn't help Montgomery. It was Steve's house, so it would have actually seemed more incriminating, and like Steve had wiped the place clean, if none of his prints had been found. So Montgomery and his investigators interviewed and re-interviewed Karen's sister Coco, Steve's co-worker and the couple's friend Ed Owens, and anybody else they could find who was even remotely close to Karen. And during these interviews, talk of Steve's drinking and potentially violent nature towards her kept coming up. Then, Montgomery talked to one of Karen's co-workers who he hadn't spoken to at the beginning of the investigation. And she said that a few months earlier, when Karen had come into work, it was plainly obvious that she had caked layers of makeup onto her neck and throat. But the woman said that despite all that makeup, she could clearly see there were dark bruises on Karen's neck. Seeing these bruises, this coworker had gotten really concerned and had asked Karen what was going on. And she told her that she had gotten the bruises when Steve tried to strangle her. And as soon as Montgomery heard this, he believed he'd finally gotten the break in the case that he needed. As far as he was concerned, this proved not only that Steve had a history of violence, but that he had already strangled his wife at least once. And so Montgomery knew his next step was to secure an arrest warrant for Steve Strom. By August of 1980, so about 2 months after Karen's murder, Steve had been arrested and was being held in custody. And over the next month, as Steve sat in prison, Detective Montgomery believed that he and his team had put together a very strong case and that Steve would soon be found guilty of murder. But in September, Montgomery got a phone call at his desk, and he heard the district attorney's voice on the other line. And the DA said he'd just gotten some really bad news. The judge had ruled that the story Karen's coworker had told about Steve strangling Karen was inadmissible as evidence. The judge had determined that witnesses could only testify on what they'd seen, not just what they'd heard. And Karen's coworker had simply passed on information about Steve strangling Karen that she said Karen had told her. Nobody, including that coworker, had actually seen Steve strangle Karen. As Detective Montgomery listened to the DA, he got a sick feeling in his stomach. And things only got worse. The DA said the issue with the coworker's story had raised concerns about any story from one of Karen's friends or family who said they believed Steve had physically assaulted Karen. Because, like that coworker, all those people had never actually seen the abuse firsthand. Montgomery knew how this conversation was going to end even before it happened, but hearing it out loud still felt like a kick in the gut. Because the DA said he no longer believed they had enough evidence to win in court. And they couldn't risk putting Steve on trial and losing, because if Steve was found not guilty in Karen's murder case, by law, he could never be tried for Karen's murder again. So, for the time being, the case would be dismissed and Steve would be set free. The call from the DA left Detective Montgomery reeling. He knew the forensics team and crime lab had done all they could do at this point. So unless a new eyewitness came out of the woodwork or some new piece of concrete evidence materialized, there was little Montgomery could do to propel the case forward. And as months passed by, nothing new surfaced. And so by early 1981, Karen's murder case had gone cold. Still, Montgomery continued to work the case whenever he had time, and he fielded regular calls from Karen's sister Coco, who desperately wanted updates. But Montgomery never had any news for her. Eventually, Detective Montgomery retired from the force, and at that point, the first reported murder in the history of Woods Cross, Utah, basically disappeared from the public eye. However, decades later, Karen's name would once again dominate the local news. In 2006, over 26 years after Karen's murder, Detective Brad Benson of the Woods Cross Police Department walked into his boss's office. Detective Benson had been a rookie on the force back in 1980 when Karen had gotten murdered. He hadn't been part of the investigation, but he'd never forgotten about the case. Over the past 2.5 decades, Woods Cross had remained a small, quiet suburb with a relatively low crime rate. And so today, Detective Benson found himself in a situation that was pretty common. He had no major criminal cases to work. So he asked his boss if he could take up a cold case, the murder of Karen Strom. His boss stared him down for a second. Like Benson, his boss knew all about the case and the huge impact it had had on the community back in the 1980s. But he wanted to know why, after so many years, Benson thought he could possibly crack the case when nobody else could. And Benson said, well, because technology had advanced leaps and bounds since Karen had gotten killed. And Benson's boss couldn't argue with that, and he said Benson could go work the cold case until another case came his way. After Benson left the office, he didn't necessarily think Karen's murder would suddenly be an open and shut case, but he knew the original investigators had a strong suspect, Karen's husband Steve, but they just could not put enough evidence together that would hold up in court. Benson quickly made his way down a brightly lit set of stairs into a much more dimly lit basement. And once he was there, he looked over shelves stacked with boxes that were filled with evidence from old or forgotten cases. Eventually, he found a box full of evidence from Karen's murder. And when he opened it, he said a silent thank you to Detective Montgomery. Because it was clear to Benson that before Montgomery retired, he had made sure that all of the evidence in that case was securely stored and cataloged in detail. And within days, Benson was able to send 2 major pieces of evidence to the crime lab for testing: clippings of Karen's fingernails and the underwear that she'd been wearing when she was found dead. Now that it was 2006, the lab could run a series of in-depth DNA tests on those pieces of evidence that back in 1980, those tests simply were not possible. Now, Detective Benson knew that since so much time had passed, there was a chance that any potential DNA samples could have become corrupted by now. But he hoped that the care that Detective Montgomery and his team had clearly shown for these pieces of evidence would mean they were still viable for testing. It would take some time for the results to come in, but in early 2007, now 27 years after Karen's murder, Detective Benson was sitting at his desk staring down at a crime lab report, and his hands were literally shaking from excitement. After reading through the whole report, Benson dug through a file folder and found a phone number. Then he grabbed a cell phone and called it. A moment later, a woman in her mid-40s answered. It was Karen's little sister, Coco. And with his voice shaking, Benson told Coco that after all this time, he finally had the evidence police needed to prove who killed her sister. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted off and on over the course of 27 years, this is what police believe happened to Karen when she was murdered in early June of 1980. The killer opened the front door of the house and walked inside. It was dark and quiet, and they slowly made their way down the hall towards the bedroom. When they reached the bedroom, they opened the door. In the moonlight shining through the window, they could see Karen lying in bed. But as the killer stepped into the room, Karen woke up, startled, and she sat upright. The killer then moved towards the bed and said something out loud. Karen could smell the alcohol in their breath and shouted for them to get out. But the killer moved fast. They lunged towards the bed and grabbed Karen by her shoulders. Karen dug her fingernails into the killer's arms and gashed them, and the killer stumbled backwards. Karen leapt out of bed and tried to run for the door, but the killer caught her and grabbed her again. Karen kept fighting. The two of them stumbled through the dark room and slammed into a table, and a small TV crashed to the floor. Karen kept slashing at the killer's arms and face, but she just couldn't break free. The killer pushed her back across the room. They knocked against the bedside table, and the killer threw Karen onto the bed. The killer then leapt on top of her, but she just kept fighting back. Both of them hit against the brass headboard, and the two brass bars just broke. Karen kicked and clawed, and she did get away from the bed again,
But this time, the killer grabbed her and slammed her down to the floor. Karen felt the wind knocked out of her and she couldn't even move, so the killer pinned her down and tried to sexually assault her. But Karen still fought back, and so the killer panicked and just wrapped their hands around her throat and began to squeeze, and Karen choked and gagged and struggled to breathe until she died right there on the floor next to her bed. After that, the killer stood up, stumbled out of the room in a daze, ran down the hall, out of the house, slamming the door behind them. They ran past the yellow Camaro parked in the front driveway and climbed into their own car. Then they hit the gas and sped off into the darkness. It was still dark out, early in the morning. The killer exhaled and relaxed a bit once they were gone. They knew it would be at least a few hours before Steve got home from work. Despite Detective Montgomery, his team, and Coco's wholehearted belief that Karen's husband Steve had killed her, that was not the case. Karen's murderer was also not the man she'd recently begun dating before she died, Buff Bangetter. Instead, the person who had killed her was Steve's co-worker and Karen and Steve's friend, Ed Owens. It would turn out that at some point during their platonic friendship, Ed had decided that he wanted more. He had become sexually attracted to Karen. And on the night of the murder, he'd left work, gone to a bar to have a few drinks, and decided that that was the night he was going to try to have sex with Karen. After all, he knew that Karen was staying at that house and that Steve was going to be out all night working, so Karen was alone. So Ed went to the yellow house and he found the front door was unlocked, which was actually pretty typical for homes in this town. In fact, police were never sure if the door had actually been locked when Steve got home the following morning like he said, or if he'd just misremembered. And so once Ed was inside the house, he went right to the bedroom and attempted to sexually assault Karen. And in the process, he killed her. Now, police had questioned Ed back in the 1980s, and in the initial interview, Detective Montgomery had noticed scratches on Ed's arms and face. But Ed had told him that he got scratches on him like that all the time from working the machines in the factory. And several of his coworkers backed that claim up. A number of people had also said they saw Ed at a local bar around the time Karen had been killed. But moreover, Montgomery and the police just could not find any clear motive that would lead Ed to kill Karen. But over 2.5 decades later, when Detective Benson took over the cold case, he sent evidence back to the crime lab, and using the latest technology, the lab was able to detect traces of seminal fluid under Karen's fingernails and blood on Karen's underwear. And that indicated to them that the killer had attempted to sexually assault Karen, but she had fought him off, and drawn drops of the killer's blood that landed on her underwear. And both of those DNA samples found on Karen matched Ed Owens. Once Benson had this information, he tracked down Ed Owens, who was 56 years old at the time, and Ed would eventually confess to the murder. Ed was found guilty, and he received a sentence based on Utah's legal statutes from when the crimes had occurred. This meant Ed was sentenced to 5 years to life in prison, which had been the maximum sentence back in 1980. He would die in prison in 2021.
Between 1974 and 1975, a criminal who had been dubbed the Visayala Ransacker had been terrorizing the Eastern District of Sacramento, California. Initially, he would break into people's homes when they were sleeping by prying open one of their windows. He would go inside and basically ransack their house. He wouldn't steal any of the major valuables that were right in plain sight. He would just kind of throw things all over the place and would take one or two small things, probably as a souvenir. Unfortunately, by the summer of 1976, this Visayala ransacker was not only not caught, but was also no longer satisfied with just breaking into people's homes and ransacking them and taking a few things. He had moved on to killing people, and so he had been given a new nickname, one that just about everybody knew at the time, and that was the Golden State Killer. Once he began killing people, he became much more cautious about how he would actually go about attacking them. He would oftentimes break into his victims' homes while they weren't there, and he would walk their property, look for guns and unload them. He would look for any security cameras or devices and turn them off. He would plant ligatures, pieces of rope and twine that he could use to bind people's arms and legs. He would place them in their house, and then he would leave. And he would study his victims and get to know their patterns and know when they were going to be in the house, when they were going to be in certain rooms. and then at some point he would sneak in through a window at night while they were sleeping, and their victims would wake up with him standing over them with a flashlight in their face. On the rare occasion where neighbors or police had actually spotted this guy, they saw that he was wearing a full face mask and he was very athletic. He was able to elude police capture and would jump over fences and would run away. By the end of 1976, when the Golden State Killer had still not been caught, citizens of Sacramento became furious with the police. They felt like they were not doing enough to try to catch this guy. So on November 3rd, 1976, the police actually host this huge town hall meeting, and they invite all the citizens of Sacramento to come be a part of it, voice your complaints, listen to what police are actually trying to do to catch the Golden State Killer, and basically just have an opportunity to air your grievances a little bit. During the meeting, a man in the crowd who was a citizen of Sacramento stands up and basically starts making fun of the Golden State Killer, calling him weak and a coward, saying, you're preying on women. If you ever came to my house, I would totally beat the crap out of you, like this guy's a joke. And everybody in the town hall meeting just totally ate it up. It was like this one little victory for the town of Sacramento, is we're gonna put down the Golden State Killer for being weak and a coward. Then, in an ironic twist of fate, that guy who was making fun of the Golden State Killer, he and his wife became the next victims of the Golden State Killer. And in fact, the Golden State Killer changed his entire MO. Instead of kind of targeting random people all over Sacramento, he began only targeting married couples, and he would always attack when the husband was home. For decades, the Golden State Killer eluded capture and even taunted the police in threatening phone calls all the way up until 2001. But in 2016, they reinvestigated the Golden State Killer case using DNA evidence, something that was not available in the 70s and the 80s when they were investigating these crimes. And it was through this reinvestigation that they were able to capture 74-year-old Joseph DeAngelo in 2018, who was, in fact, the Golden State Killer. DeAngelo pled guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and was given 12 consecutive life sentences. When the killer was finally identified as Joseph DeAngelo, police were going through some of the older case photos and they made a startling discovery. This is a picture from the November 3rd, 1976 town hall meeting, and there in the middle of the photo is none other than Joseph DeAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer. And he was there when that citizen of Sacramento stood up and began berating the Golden State Killer, saying how he was a coward and weak and that he would totally beat him up if he ever came to his house. And there's Joseph DeAngelo sitting there listening to this guy. And after the meeting, what does he do? He targets the guy that spoke out against him. And even after he attacked this guy, apparently he was so upset that he changed his entire MO and only targeted married couples from that point on, as if he was proving a point that you can't touch me. By the time Tyler Hadley turned 15, he was skipping school regularly and hanging out with the wrong crowd. Tyler's parents had tried to do everything to get their son back on track between doctor's visits, psychiatry appointments, medication, an outpatient mental health program, but none of it seemed to work. Tyler just was on the wrong path. As Tyler's behavior continued to get worse as he got older, his parents just didn't know what to do, became very frustrated with him, and became very, very strict disciplinarians. One night when Tyler came home and he appeared to be intoxicated, his parents took his phone and car away, and Tyler was furious. And he confided in his best friend Michael Mandel that he thought his parents had gone over the line, that they were over-disciplining him, and he said to Michael that he wanted to kill his mother. Now, Michael knew Tyler and had known him since he was a little kid, and he did not think twice about this claim that, Tyler wanted to kill his mom. He just thought that Tyler was frustrated with his parents, and Michael did know that Tyler's parents were very, very strict and hard on him. So he just kind of wrote it off. Not long after this incident, Tyler starts talking about this huge house party he's going to have. And all of Tyler's friends, including Michael, just didn't buy it. They're like, there's no way you could ever pull this off. Your parents are too strict and they never leave town anyways. But every time people approached him, he would say, oh no, my parents aren't going to be there. They'll never find out. At some point, Michael gets a Facebook invitation to Tyler's big house party, and he sees that it's been sent to so many people. It's been sent well beyond an inner circle of friends to just total strangers. And then on the Facebook invitation itself, someone had posted on the wall, hey Tyler, what are you going to do if your parents come home? And he responded to that, they won't, trust me. On the day of the party, Michael shows up to Tyler's house and it is packed with people. Lots of people he didn't know, and he was fairly certain Tyler didn't know them either. And he goes inside and it's clear that no one gives a crap about the house itself. People are writing on the walls, people have spilled stuff all over the ground, there's broken glass on the ground, people are rummaging through the food in the fridge. No one cared about the house. And Tyler, oddly enough, didn't seem to mind at all. The only time Tyler became on edge was when he felt like the party was getting too loud. And he would go around and tell people to be quiet because he didn't want his neighbors to hear, because the neighbors would call the police and he didn't want the police coming to the house. During this big party, Tyler pulls Michael aside and says, "Hey, I gotta tell you something. Come outside with me." When they get outside, Tyler looks at Mike and just says, "Mike, I killed my parents." Michael doesn't believe him, but Tyler says, "No, look in my driveway. Their car is still here. They did not go to Orlando. I killed my parents." Michael still didn't believe him, and Tyler said, "Go inside. I bet if you look around, you'll find blood in my house." So he goes inside and he starts looking around, and when he goes upstairs, he sees there's blood on a table right outside the master bedroom where Tyler's parents slept. And on the door handle to the master bedroom, there was also blood. So he goes back down, and he goes, "Tyler, you're playing a prank on me." And Tyler goes, "No, when the party dies down, I'll show you proof." At this point, Michael is starting to think this could actually be real. And Tyler walks away, and Michael's thinking to himself, I can't wait till the end of this party to see if this is really true or not. So he goes upstairs, goes to the bloody door handle to the master bedroom, opens it up, and the door actually hits the leg of Tyler's father, who's laying on the ground, who's deceased inside of the master bedroom. He shuts the door and he's standing in the hall, and he doesn't know what to do, because on the one hand, Tyler's his friend, but he just discovered Tyler's a murderer. He also knew Tyler's parents really well, so he's deeply saddened by what he just saw. And as he's standing there, he's realizing that he has to turn Tyler in. And so for some reason, he just felt the need to take one more picture with Tyler, because he knew as soon as he left the house, he was going to go tell authorities what Tyler had done, and he was never going to see him again. And so he goes over to Tyler and he takes this picture. After Tyler was arrested, he admitted that just hours before this house party, he had bludgeoned his parents to death and stashed them in the master bedroom. Tyler was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and while he has been remorseful, he's never given a real reason why he actually killed his parents. On the morning of Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, a Colorado high school student named Brooks Brown noted something strange. His on-again, off-again friend named Eric had missed all of the classes that morning, something that is totally uncharacteristic of Eric, who was a straight-A student. At lunchtime, Brown left the high school to go to the designated smoking area in the parking lot, and he saw parked in a very far away spot, somewhere that he never saw him park before, was his friend Eric, who was in the back of his car pulling a large duffel bag out of the trunk. Brown puts his cigarette out and walks over and asks Eric, "Where have you been all morning?" And Eric turns to Brown and goes, "It doesn't matter. I'd like you, so you should leave right now. Go home." Brown was taken back by his tone and the general weirdness of the morning, but Eric was always kind of a wild card. He was a guy that had, in the past, vandalized Brown's house. He had posted death threats online about Brown. And then simultaneously, he would brag to Brown all the time about different accomplishments, like he desperately wanted approval from Brown. So it was a very strange relationship they had. Brown doesn't really know what to make of this, and so he kind of just shrugs his shoulders, turns around and walks away, while Eric turns around and continues doing whatever he's doing with his duffel bag. Brown gets back over to the smoking area, and he's thinking, maybe I should just skip class and go home, because maybe Eric has some prank that he's got planned that he's protecting me from. And as he's sitting there smoking his cigarette, thinking about whether or not he's going to stay or go, he hears noises coming from the high school that he immediately assumes are fireworks. And so in his mind, he's like, oh, looks like he was planning a senior prank. He's lighting fireworks inside of the school. But then the sounds got faster and louder, and he turned to look at the school and he heard people screaming, and he knew those weren't fireworks, those were gunshots. Brown immediately runs to the nearest house, knocks on their door, and is able to get a phone, and he calls police. After Eric had spoken to Brown, when Brown came across the lot and asked him what he was doing, and then ultimately Brown turned around and walked back to the smoke pit, Eric had turned his attention to his duffel bag. He had pulled it out and dragged it across the lot to another car where one of his other friends named Dylan was also getting his own duffel bag out of the back of his own car. Inside of their duffel bags were propane tank time bombs that they planned to place all around the school in an effort to collapse the ceiling of the cafeteria, because what they wanted to do is get people to start running out of the school so they could start shooting at them. Eric and Dylan's car were parked far away from their usual spots, kind of strategically located near where first responders were bound to come in, and they had rigged their cars to explode so that when they did come through, they would detonate and hopefully take out the first responders as well. Eric and Dylan had also placed another timed explosive on a field about 3 miles away that was purely a diversion. They were hoping it would go off, it would get police and first responders over there first, giving them more time to inflict max damage on the school. But with the exception of the diversionary bomb that did go off, none of the other explosives in the high school actually went off. So Dylan and Eric had to go to plan B, which is to walk right in the school and just start shooting. At the end of the day, 12 students from Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado had been killed, along with one of their teachers, as well as Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the two shooters. At the time, this was far and away the deadliest American school shooting. This senior class picture was taken 2 weeks before the Columbine shooting, and you can clearly see Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold pointing finger guns at the camera. At the time this picture was taken, they both knew what they were going to do to the students in that picture, because they had been planning this attack for over a year and referred to it as Judgment Day.
Right in the middle of the United States is a quiet little town called Millstadt, Illinois. Millstadt is home to about 4,000 people, and had it not been for Ashley Reeves, only those 4,000 people and their friends and family would even know that Millstadt existed. In 2006, Ashley Reeves was a 17-year-old high school student who lived with her parents and her younger sister Casey in Millstadt. Ashley was an excellent student who, even though she was over a year from her high school graduation, she was already thinking about what colleges she wanted to go to. She was also extremely likable and outgoing, and she had this huge infectious smile, and so she had tons of friends, and she had a very serious boyfriend who her parents adored. His name was Jeremy, and he was a high school student as well. On the morning of Thursday, April 27th of that year, Ashley got up, and like every other morning, she got ready for school alongside her sister Casey, and then right before Ashley stepped out to head off to school, she told her parents that after school, she had a job interview on the other side of town, and then after her interview, her plan was to play basketball with some friends, and then she'd be home. And so her parents said, okay, well, hey, good luck with your job interview, and just make sure you're home before 10:30 p.m. And so Ashley said, no problem, I'll see you tonight, and then she left. That afternoon, after school, Ashley made her way to Jeremy's locker, and when she got to him, Jeremy handed her his keys to his car. He had an SUV, and he was lending it to her for the day so she could go to the interview and then go play basketball. And so Ashley took the keys, she thanked him, she gave him a hug, and then she turned and she walked down the hallway where she met up with her sister Casey at her locker, and then the two girls left the school, they went out to the student parking lot, they found Jeremy's SUV, they hopped inside, and then Ashley began driving them back to their house. When they got there, Casey hopped out of the car, she said bye to Ashley, and then Ashley left their house and she began driving to Fairview Heights, which was a town about 15 miles away where her interview was going to be. Several hours later, around 10 p.m., Ashley's parents had not heard from their daughter, and it was getting close to her curfew, and so they asked Casey if she had spoken with Ashley, and, did she know how her interview went? Did she know when she was going to be home? But Casey would tell them, actually, no, I haven't talked to Ashley since she dropped me off from school. And so Ashley's parents said, okay, no big deal, and they called Ashley, but Ashley didn't pick up. So they sent her a series of text messages, but after a couple of minutes of not getting any response, they decided to just call her boyfriend Jeremy to see if maybe he knew what was going on with Ashley. But when they spoke to Jeremy, he would say that, I haven't spoken with Ashley since I gave her the keys to my SUV, and I've actually been trying to talk to her all day. I've been calling her and texting her, but I still haven't heard back. And so at this point, Ashley's parents were starting to get really worried, and so after hanging up with Jeremy, they began calling other friends of Ashley's to see if maybe they had spoken to her and knew what was going on. But all of her friends that they spoke to all had the same story. We haven't talked to her since the end of school, and she's not returning our calls or texts. And so Ashley's mother, she just sensed that something was terribly wrong. And so without any hesitation, she just called the police. Now, the police in this town were used to getting calls every now and again from parents whose teenage child had run off and they were concerned about them, but virtually every time the police investigated, they would find the teenager had just kind of been blowing off their friends and family, and they would pop up maybe a couple hours later totally unharmed. But
the Millstadt police would later remark when they heard Ashley's mother's voice over the phone, the fear in her voice was so pronounced, it immediately pushed the police department to take this case very seriously. And so that night, right after this phone call, the Millstadt Police Department went out in force to try to locate Jeremy's SUV, the car that Ashley had been driving around that day. And the first place they went to look for this car was Latterman Park, which is this very popular public park that has a really popular basketball court that lots of teenagers would go to all the time, and Ashley was known to frequent that park. And this park was located about halfway between Fairview Heights, where her interview was, and Millstadt, where she lived. And so they go to Latterman Park, and right away, sitting in the parking lot, they find Jeremy's SUV. But Ashley is not in the car, she's nowhere near the car, and when they searched the car, there was nothing of significance inside of it. There was just some of Ashley's clothes lying around. The police would spend all night and well into the morning combing Latterman Park looking for any sign of Ashley, but there wasn't one. And so as the sun came up and the police were nowhere closer to finding this girl, they began to suspect that, perhaps foul play was involved. And so the first person they hauled in for questioning was Ashley's boyfriend, Jeremy. But as soon as he sat in the interrogation room, he demonstrated a real concern for Ashley. He had a rock-solid alibi, and he basically was an open book. And so they quickly ruled him out as a suspect. And then the police basically began hauling in all of Ashley's friends and acquaintances and family members, basically anybody that knew her. They were bringing them into the station to find out if they knew anything that could help them figure out where Ashley was. And more specifically, the police were really looking to see if any of these people were hiding something. And sure enough, a few of the friends that were brought in were. According to a few of Ashley's closest friends, Ashley was in not one, but two romantic relationships. One was the public relationship she had with Jeremy, and the other was a secret relationship that was actually illegal. In order to hide this forbidden second relationship, Ashley would tell her family and her friends that she was going to the park to play basketball, when in reality, she was going to the park to meet up with this secret second partner. And the day before, when Ashley went missing, her friends told police that that was the exact reason she was going to Latterman Park. The police got the name of this secret person from Ashley's friends. His name was Sam Shelton, and the police tracked him down. When they found him, he was at a baseball practice, but the police didn't care. They marched right onto the baseball diamond, and they grabbed Sam, and they brought him back to the police station. And then when he got there, they sat him down in the interrogation room, and he's still wearing his baseball uniform, and they ask him about his relationship with Ashley. And he immediately denies it and says he does not have a relationship with Ashley. He's got no idea why he's here. But pretty quickly, after a few questions, Sam's answers became inconsistent, and so the police just ratcheted up the pressure on him. And then finally, after 12 hours of questioning, the interrogator brings up Sam's mother and his grandmother, and he says to Sam, how would they feel if they knew you were lying to the police right now? And this just broke Sam, and so he cracked. Now, at this point, the police were already expecting the worst when it came to Ashley, but they were not ready for just how brutal Sam's confession would be about what exactly he did to her. The following is an account based on his confession. 30 hours earlier, Ashley wrapped up her interview in Fairview Heights, and she made her way to Latterman Park to meet up with Sam. And now it's not clear exactly how they met up, but eventually the two of them did connect, and they made their way over to Sam's car, where they became intimate. Afterwards, the two are sitting in the front two seats of Sam's car. Sam is in the driver's seat and Ashley is in the passenger seat. And while they're sitting there, something happens that causes this huge fight between the two of them. And at some point, Sam tells Ashley to get out of the car. But Ashley refuses. She wants to talk to him. She wants to deal with their issues, but Sam's not having it. And so he gets so mad at her that he lunges across the center console of the car, and he puts Ashley into a vicious chokehold. Now, he tells police his plan was to kind of yank her out of the car, but he squeezed so hard around her neck that he heard this loud popping sound coming from her neck. It was the sound of her neck breaking. And so as soon as he heard it, Sam let go, and Ashley kind of crumpled forward and hit the front dashboard of the car. And so Sam is staring at her, wondering what he should do. He's kind of looking around, making sure no one saw what he just did. And then he reached over and lifted her back up to see if she was still alive, and he saw she was. But instead of trying to get her help, he decides right then and there he's going to kill her. And so he reaches over and he begins choking her. But after several minutes of throttling her, she just wouldn't die. And so Sam pulled his belt off of his waist and he wrapped it around Ashley's neck. And then he began pulling. But he would tell police he couldn't stand looking at Ashley's face while he did this. He said she was staring right at him, her tongue was coming out of her mouth, she was frothing, and her face was turning this ghastly shade of gray-blue. And so at some point, when she still hadn't died, he released the belt from around her neck, and he turned her body so she was facing the window away from him, and then he repositioned the belt on her neck, and then he put his foot on her back to use as leverage, and then he pulled as hard as he possibly could on her throat for quite a while until the belt actually broke around her neck. And then at that point, he checked to make sure she was dead, and when she was, he stuffed her down into the floorboards in front of the passenger seat, and then he drove several miles across town to another park called Citizens Park that was very heavily forested. And once he parked in the parking lot, he looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then he dragged Ashley's body out of the car and deep into the woods where he abandoned her. It would turn out Ashley was far from the only teenage girl who found Sam Shelton attractive. Many teenage girls in the area thought he was the perfect catch. He was smart, he was handsome, and he had these beautiful, striking blue eyes that you couldn't help but just stare at. However, there was something unique about Sam that made him fundamentally different than all the other guys at their schools. Sam was not a student. He was a 27-year-old middle school teacher in Millstadt, and he also was the high school baseball coach. He had never been Ashley's teacher directly. However, years earlier when she was in middle school, he had begun grooming her for exploitation. And so fast forward to 2006, when she was 17, he had effectively manipulated her into believing she was in this romantic relationship with him, when in reality, he was just using his position of power to abuse her. In addition to being a school teacher, Sam was also an aspiring pro wrestler. He would often compete in local showcases under the nickname The Teacher. While Sam was probably nowhere near good enough to actually become a professional wrestler like you would see on TV, he was extremely strong and really knew how to do a chokehold. And so when he attacked Ashley and put her in that vicious chokehold, she had no chance at escaping. She was completely doomed. Shortly after his confession, Sam would tell the police that he would take them out into the forest of Citizens Park to try to find Ashley's body. But when they got there, it was late, it had been raining for several hours, and Sam right away acted like he couldn't figure out exactly where he had left her. And so the police were actually starting to think, is he lying to us? Is this whole thing just kind of made up? Did he really attack her? Is she really out here? But after about 30 minutes of the police and Sam kind of trudging around the thick forest, one of the officers suddenly sees something on the ground. He raises his flashlight, and there in a clearing is Ashley's body. And so the police and Sam, they walk over to her, and they're standing above her ruined body. Her neck is totally bent at a grotesque angle. She's covered in bugs. But as they're standing there and they're watching her, her chest suddenly starts to move. She wasn't dead. She had been left for dead, and she had been out in the woods with a broken neck for 30 hours in the freezing cold and the rain. She only had a t-shirt and some pants on, but she was alive. And so moments later, the paramedics, they come rushing into the forest, they pick her up really gently, they bring her out, and they rush her to the hospital where she'd be put into a medically induced coma. The doctors would tell her family that unfortunately her injuries were just too serious and we don't expect her to ever wake up again. But miraculously, she would. Now, she would have to relearn how to walk and talk and eat and drink, but she would do all of those things. And today, she is 32 years old, she is happily married, she has 2 kids of her own, and by and large, she leads a very happy, normal life. As for Sam Shelton, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder, and he's still in prison today. However, he is up for parole in 2024. So that's going to do it. In 2012, 62-year-old Jose Malena was living in Los Angeles. He was the father of 6 children, and he had been working at Bumblebee Foods for the past 5 years. One of Jose's responsibilities at the plant was loading the massive industrial oven that was 54 inches wide by 36 feet long with these huge pallets of tuna in cans. The oven was designed to sterilize the actual can itself and process the tuna inside of them. At 4 a.m. on October 11th, Jose arrived at the Santa Fe Springs plant where he worked, and his supervisor immediately tasked him with loading a particular oven. So Jose left and got 12,000 pounds of tuna in cans, and he put them on this dolly, and he wheeled it over to the oven. He walked over and opened up the oven door, and he looked inside, and he saw there was a loose chain in the back. And so even though he knew he wasn't supposed to go inside of the oven for obvious reasons, he knew he could fix that chain in just a couple of minutes. And so he decided he would just go in there and get it done. A couple of hours later, a supervisor asked the other workers if they had seen Jose, and no one had. And so they searched the inside of the plant. He was nowhere to be seen. His workstation at that oven had been cleaned up. They called out to him on the intercom to come up to the office, but he didn't show up. They went outside and they found his car was still parked in the parking lot. When they went back inside, everybody was just stumped about where Jose could have gone. And so they searched the building one more time, and then finally one of the workers said, "The only place we haven't looked is inside the oven he was last seen loading." And so they turned off the oven, but they had to wait 30 minutes for it to cool down before it was safe to go inside. And when they finally opened up the door, they found Jose pressed up against the inside of the door trying to get out. He had been cooked alive. Earlier, when Jose had gone inside of the oven to fix that loose chain, he had left all 12,000 pounds of this tuna sitting on a pallet dolly right outside the entrance to this oven. And so another co-worker had been walking down the row of ovens, and the door to the oven swings out, and so it would have blocked his view to look inside of the oven. And this worker saw this huge pallet of tuna sitting right outside, ready to be pushed directly into the oven. And so he assumed Jose must have stepped away to go to the bathroom. And so thinking he was doing him a favor, he walked over and pushed the pallets right inside, shut and locked the door without ever seeing Jose. And Jose, who was at the back of the oven, was probably caught off guard by the pallets suddenly coming in, and they boxed him in. He could not have ran to the front to get out in time. And it was so loud inside of the plant that even if Jose had been yelling, "Hey, I'm in here," it's unlikely the other coworker would have heard him. Once Jose's coworker turned on the oven he was inside of, it would not have immediately heated up to lethal temperatures. In fact, it was a fairly gradual heating process up to 270 degrees over a 2-hour period. And the human body can survive at 200 degrees or higher for up to 10 minutes. But at 212 degrees, your blood will actually boil, and that would kill you. Which means Jose would have had the time to fully recognize the situation he was in. And unfortunately, there was no kill switch inside of the oven, and there was no emergency exit. And so Jose just forced himself along the edge of the oven, past all the pallets to the front door, and banged on it until he slowly cooked to death. The deputy district attorney that prosecuted Bumblebee Foods in the lawsuit that followed this case said this was the worst circumstances of death he had ever witnessed. Bumblebee Foods paid Jose's family $1.5 million. They also paid $3 million to upgrade all of their industrial ovens. Jacob Cockle always loved the water. He grew up in a town called Penzance in the UK, and he spent virtually all of his time surfing at one of their beaches. By the time he was 10 years old, he started skipping school to go surfing and started getting in a lot of trouble for that. But despite his parents' and his teachers' frustrations with him, there was always one person that had his back and totally understood him, and that was his older sister, Grace. They were so close, they developed their own special language they talked to each other in, and Jacob used it so much that people actually thought he had a speech problem. But when Jacob was 17, his life was turned upside down when Grace was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and she died very quickly after that. This had a profound impact on Jacob. It was like his entire view of the world had totally changed overnight, and he began to believe that Grace's energy had been transferred to him, and that it was now his duty to live for the two of them. And so what this translated to is Jacob began taking lots and lots of risks because he felt like he didn't want to pass up opportunities. He wanted to live life to the fullest, even if it was a little bit reckless. In addition to loving the water, Jacob also loved photography. And so with this new risk-taking attitude, he began doing these water-based stunts and filming himself in the process. Things like surfing in storms, or leaping off of buildings into fairly shallow water, or diving to dangerous depths on a breath hold. And Jacob loved it. He loved taking these risks. He loved filming himself taking these risks. And so he decided this was going to be his career. He was going to be a world-famous photographer that specialized in dangerous photos and films. And so Jacob got this big piece of paper and he put it on his bedroom wall, and with black marker, he wrote himself a reminder, "I will become a world-famous photographer, and I will let nothing stand in my way." Basically, he was prepared to go to any length to get the shots that he needed to get. And this intense attitude worked. By his early 20s, he had won major awards with National Geographic and the Sunday Times. He was also a regular contributor to surf magazines, where he almost always got the cover shot. Most of his award-winning pictures were taken of the sea in its most violent and turbulent forms. Like the shot of a fishing boat coming back into port in a large swell won a competition that put it all over the London Underground. Or this shot he took, which is off the coast of Sumatra out in the middle of the ocean, as Jacob and his friend are right in front of the supertanker that's bearing down on both of them, and his friend is surfing off the wake caused by the supertanker. So a very dangerous picture to take, but it won an award that was run by The Guardian. The money Jacob earned from these competitions he spent on improving his photography equipment. If he was ever given a physical prize, like a brand new TV, he would just give it away to his friends, because all Jacob was really focused on was going out and living life to the fullest and taking crazy chances and capturing those experiences on film. And one crazy experience that he had always wanted to capture on film actually took place right in his hometown of Penzance. A very strong whirlpool would appear a few times a year in a harbor that was right near his childhood home. It was just a quirk of engineering designed to keep the harbor from silting up. At high tide, the water would come in and it would hit this quay wall, and at the bottom of the quay wall was a tunnel that fed into this other pool. And so that would fill up with water, and then when the tide retreated during low tide, the water in the harbor would drain out and the water from the pool would slowly filter out back through this tunnel, pushing the silt and sand out of the harbor. But sometimes when the water came into the harbor during high tide, it would come in so quickly it would build up against the quay wall and it wouldn't drain fast enough down through that tunnel into the pool. And so just like in your bathtub, if you pull the plug when it's full, you'll see a whirlpool form as the water is sucked down the drain. The same thing would happen at this quay wall as all this water is being forced down and sucked through this pipe. It would create this huge whirlpool that you could see on the surface from the quay wall. And even though this whirlpool only formed a couple of times a year, it was so dangerous. There were caution signs all around the edge of the harbor and on the quay wall telling people to stay out of the water. But in his mid-20s, Jacob ignored those signs and he started jumping into this whirlpool every time it formed. And he was able to kind of swirl around the outside, and he would film it inside and just on top, and he would upload his videos to YouTube, and they would get millions and millions of views. They were totally beautiful and terrifying at the same time. On May 28th, 2013, when Jacob was 28 years old, he noticed that the whirlpool was back in his hometown, and he wanted to go out and film inside of it again. And so he ran to his friend David's house and he asked him to, hey, come down to the harbor and film me inside of this whirlpool. And so by the time David got his stuff together and made it to the quay wall, he looked down and he saw Jacob was already in the whirlpool swirling around. David also noticed that Jacob was wearing a rubber horse head mask, and he told David the reason he was doing it is because it would be more eye-catching on YouTube. So David leaned over the wall and began filming Jacob as he swirled around this whirlpool in his horse mask making neighing sounds, and at some point Jacob stopped and he swam away from the whirlpool, but you could see the pull of the whirlpool was very strong, because even with flippers on, Jacob really struggled to swim away from this whirlpool. But he was in good spirits about it, and he was laughing with David and saying how when he first jumped in, he was actually pretty scared of this whirlpool. It's definitely the strongest one he had been in over at this quay wall. And David would say, yeah, I can tell from up here, that one's really strong. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, David and Jacob kind of joked back and forth about the strength of the whirlpool, and Jacob would put his mask back down and swirl around inside of the whirlpool, then get out again. And then towards the end of the video, Jacob yells up to David that he only has one more thing in mind that he wants to do with the whirlpool. He wants to dive down below and film it from underneath. And so he asks David to hand down his camera. David hands it down, and you see Jacob adjusting his camera, and then he dives below the surface to begin filming this whirlpool. And so David's up on the top watching Jacob, and he's very familiar with Jacob. He knows he does things like this. He knows he has a great breath hold. But after a couple of minutes, when he doesn't reemerge, David gets scared and starts yelling for him. And when he still doesn't come up, David turns and runs to the other side of the quay wall and looks over that railing towards the pool side, and he can see the water is still rushing into the pool, and there's no sign of Jacob. And so he ran back and forth forth a couple of times and he didn't see Jacob until finally he went back to the poolside and he saw Jacob down below. He was lying face down in the water. So David ran down and waded out to him, but it was already too late. Jacob had drowned. The reason Jacob was able to swirl around at the top of this whirlpool and not get pulled under is because he had a wetsuit on, and wetsuits are buoyant. But as you go underneath the water, the deeper you go, the water pressure pushes against your wetsuit and it reduces the overall buoyancy of your wetsuit. And so when Jacob dove down into this whirlpool, the pressure pushed against his suit, he lost his buoyancy, and then he got caught up in the current of this very strong whirlpool, and he was pulled slowly down to the bottom. And so he probably fought as much as he could to try to get out of there, but he couldn't, and eventually was forced into that tunnel underneath the quay wall, and he was under there until he drowned, and then he was eventually spit out the other side. In July of 1988, 18-year-old Adriana and her husband, Jay Dickinson, were living in Anchorage, Alaska, just 1 month after getting married in Nevada. Jay, who had lived in Alaska for several years before Adriana joined him, had taken up an interest in something called placer mining, which is basically mining riverbeds for minerals like gold. And as soon as Adriana moved in, she picked up the hobby as well. The area they mined for gold was south of Anchorage in Cook Inlet. Jay owned a gold claim there. Over the years, Jay had found it to be very cumbersome just getting to Cook Inlet. Even though it was just south of Anchorage, the roads forced him to drive all the way around the inlet before being allowed in. However, he had discovered a shortcut. During low tide in the inlet, one of the two northern waterways that fed into the inlet, called the Turnagain Arm, would be completely dried up and it would turn into this huge open mudflat. And so Jay could leave Anchorage, go south, leave the highway at the Turnagain Arm, and drive directly over and across the mudflats and reach his gold claim in half the time. On the evening of July 14th, the young couple decided that the next day they wanted to go gold mining. And so Jay checked the tides of the inlet to see what the status would be for the next day, and he was pleasantly surprised to see that very early the next morning there would be a low tide. Perfect for them. And so the next day, the couple got up at sunrise, they hopped in their Jeep, and they started heading south. They left Anchorage, they hopped on the highway, and they went south all the way to the access point to Turnagain Arm, and they looked out in front of them, and sure enough, it's completely low tide and it's ready for them to drive over. As they turned off the highway and drove down the small access road that brought them to the actual mudflats, they passed by a series of signs telling them not to go on the mudflats. But Jay had done this dozens of times without any incident, and Deanna, she'd done it only a couple of times, but both times it had been no big deal, so neither of them paid any attention to the cautionary signs. Soon they were rolling across the mudflats on their way to Jay's gold claim, but on their way, their Jeep suddenly got stuck in the mud. And Deanna, she hopped out, she went to the back of the Jeep and began pressing as Jay pushed down on the accelerator. The Jeep eventually lurched forward and was free of the mud, but Deanna was actually now stuck in the mud because as she pushed, she drove both of her legs down deep into this mud. She tried to pull herself out, she couldn't do it, and so Jay hopped out of the Jeep, walked around the mud, and got to his wife and began pulling on her. He couldn't get her out, but he told her he had a good idea. He went back to his Jeep and he got his dredge that he was going to use to try to look for gold, and he pushed it down into the mud and began sucking up the mud around one of her legs. And he figured if he just created enough of an air pocket by sucking out enough mud, she could pull that leg out, and then he could do the same thing with the other leg. And although it was a slow process, it was working, and slowly but surely they managed to get one of her legs out of the mud right as the 38-degree water began coming in because tide was starting to come in. Neither of them were panicking because the dredge was clearly working, and if they could just get her other foot out, it wouldn't matter that the water was starting to come in. They would be able to get back to land, back to the highway before they got caught in the high tide. And so he put the dredge down next to her other leg and he began pulling the mud out, and it was working, but then the dredge broke and he couldn't fix it. And Deanna's starting to panic, Jay's starting to panic. He puts the dredge back in the Jeep, he gets a shovel, and he runs back to his wife and begins frantically trying to dig her out, but he can barely move the mud. It's like it's cement. And that's actually the reason why there's so many signs around these mudflats telling people to not go on them. Because there's a very small window of time between low tide and high tide where the ground goes from being solid and you can drive a car on it to being very soupy, and it's very easy to get stuck in it. But before the tide completely comes back in again, it re-hardens. And so if you're stuck in the mud and you don't get out again before it hardens again, you will remain stuck in the mud and 30 feet of water will come in on top of you. And so Deanna's trying to pull her leg out and she's panicking, and Jay is doing everything he can to try to get down there and get her foot out, but the ground's hardened at this point. Her leg is completely trapped inside of the mud and the water is starting to come in faster and faster and faster. Jay told her he had to run back to the highway to try try to get some help. He couldn't take his Jeep. There was too much water that had come in. It's now up to their knees. And so their Jeep's worthless. And so Jay is running away from Adriana, who's screaming for help. She's trying to get her leg out. There's nothing he can do. And so he's running through the water. He gets up to the highway and he manages to flag down some motorists, and he pleads with them to please come out into the water and help me get my wife out. She's stuck in the mud. And they look out and she's flailing around and screaming, and the water is now up to her waist. And so two of these motorists actually run down into the water with Jay and risk their own lives to try to get Adriana out. Meanwhile, another motorist took off for a nearby cafe where he could alert authorities that someone is trapped and they need someone out there right now. Very quickly, the fire department and the state troopers arrived on scene, and they look out and they see the motorists and Jay trying to pull Adriana out, and the water has crept even higher up on her body. She's screaming, she's panicked, and Mike Opalka, who's one of these state troopers, he immediately ran over to the fire department and he got this big rubber tube and he charged into the water and ran out to Adriana and grabbed her and said, everything's going to be okay. We're going to get you out of here. And he gave her the tube and he says, you need to start breathing through this. The water's going to be over your head soon. And so Adriana, who's shaking because she's hypothermic and because she's terrified, she takes this tube and she's clutching it as the other rescue workers are running down with all their equipment to try to get her out. And then not that long after that, the tide had come in to the point where it was over her head, and all they could see of Adriana was this rubber tube she was keeping out of the water. But unfortunately, every attempt the rescue workers made failed, including getting a helicopter in and attaching a harness to Adriana and trying to pull her out that way. Nothing worked. The first responders and the motorists and everyone stayed with Diana, holding on to her and trying to pull her out. But at some point, the water was too cold and it was getting too deep, and they could not stay out there with her long enough. Michael Polka, the state trooper, was the last one out there with her, and he was struggling to keep his head over the water as he's still trying to pull her up. And at some point, he noticed the tube she had been breathing in popped up on the surface with both ends exposed, so it had come out of her mouth. And so he fumbled with it, but his hand was so cold from the water, he couldn't really grip it. He tried to reach down to give her the hose, but she was flailing and panicking, and she couldn't get the hose. She could not breathe through it, and at some point she went still. And Mike knew there was nothing he could do. She was gone, and so he let go of her, and being hypothermic himself, he barely was able to swim back to the shore and get out and go up onto the highway with the others. And there they sat for the next 6 hours as they waited for the tide to come all the way in and then go all the way out again and loosen up to the point where they could go out and retrieve Diana's body. Unfortunately, had authorities been alerted to Diana's situation a little bit earlier, they could have got a special water pump out to the mudflats, and it would have been able to get her out even if the mud was hardened. But by the time that pump arrived on scene, it was already too late. The water was well over Diana's head and she had already let go of the tube. So that's going to do it back. So today we're going to talk about one of the more well-known unsolved mysteries, and it is the very strange disappearance of two college students from the Netherlands who go to Panama, and they've saved up all this money to go on this trip. Like, they were working in a cafe for the 6 months leading up to this trip that they were going to finance mostly themselves. They had mapped out all these different places they're going to go in Panama. It was going to be like part vacation, part like mission trip, where they were going to be helping out with different charities in the different villages they go to, but also enjoying the travel. These girls were very close. They were highly intelligent. They were just wonderful, smart people, and they were really excited about this trip. And they go to Panama, and the first couple weeks go without incident. And at some point, things take a very significant turn for the worst. And so let's dive in. On March 15th, 2014, Chris Kremers and Lisanne Vroon, who were both Dutch college students, head to Panama for a 6-week-long part vacation, part charitable giving trip. They had mapped out these 6 weeks really diligently. They planned to do lots of traveling and exploring, and then also they were going to be working with different charities along the way as they went all over Panama. And they were really excited about it. They had even worked for the 6 months leading up to this trip at a cafe to raise additional money for this trip. So March 15th, they arrive in Panama. The first 2 weeks they're there go beautifully. They do some traveling, they're working with different charities, and everything is going to plan. And then by the second week, they arrive in a little town called Boquete, and they stay at this hostel. So that's like a group living situation. It's pretty common amongst travelers all over the world, where to save money, you'll crash at these almost like dorms where other travelers and people will stay in the same room as you. 2 weeks in, they're in Boquete and they're living in this hostel. So on April 1st, they're in Boquete and they want to go on this fairly significant hike, which is going to be around this massive volcano called the Baru volcano. Up near, I guess, the summit of the volcano, there was this amazing overlook where if you climbed up to it, you could get a beautiful 360-degree view of the entire area. Froon and Kremers decide they want to go hike up to that overlook. They were experienced hikers, but realistically, I don't think they were taking this hike particularly seriously. It was a hike that was traditionally a guided hike, meaning usually you went and did this with a local who could make sure you didn't leave the path or, fall where you didn't know there was a cliff or something. They opt to do this on their own. So they head out and they bring the hostel owner had a dog, and they decide to bring that dog along with them. It was a very friendly dog. So Kremers, Froon, and the dog head off for this hike up this volcano. They had a digital camera with them, in addition to water, and they had their phones, they had all the different kind of basic supplies. They had a camera, and so this is important because they take a bunch of pictures as they begin this journey. So that night, the dog returns to the hostel, but the girls aren't with the dog, and so this alerts the owners of the hostel. But they search the area, like I guess the immediate area, for the girls. They can't find them, and they decide, we'll just wait until the morning and see if they turn up. The next morning, they don't turn up. Additionally, the parents of the girls, they were used to getting very regular text messages from these girls to kind of let them know that everything was okay, and the text messages stopped. And so that alerted the parents as well by the second day after they've gone missing. And so authorities are alerted. Search crews were organized on foot for the first day. So April 2nd, there are search crews all over the place looking for these girls. Can't find anything. The next day, they set up aerial search teams. They're scouring the jungle looking for signs of these girls. No sign of them. The search continues, and then on April 6th, the parents of Kremers and Froon, they arrive in Panama. They immediately offer a $30,000 reward for any information about their daughters, which is a ton of money in Panama. It's roughly equivalent to about $500,000 in a developed country. I mean, with 30,000 US dollars in Panama, I mean, you could buy land, you could buy a house, you could start a business. I mean, this is big money. And considering many people, especially in that area, were day laborers that were working for like less than $10 a day, I mean, you would think that type of reward for just information about these girls would incite hundreds of people to just on their own go looking for these girls. And if you consider too that, I mean, this is a small town. I mean, news travels fast. This is the area they probably grew up in. They know the area really well. The idea that with an amazing incentive, the financial incentive, and just the fact that they know this area really, really well, it was odd that nothing was turning up. There were no leads coming in. 3 months go by and there is not a sign of these girls anywhere. They have vanished. There's no leads. Nothing's been found. Obviously at this point, the family and investigators have pretty much accepted that they're probably deceased at this point, but they're looking for them. They want to know what happened. And a local woman finds Froon's backpack, her blue backpack, 5 miles away from where the girls were supposedly hiking, or where they had intended to hike. Navigating a jungle is exceptionally difficult. Even with the right equipment, even knowing what you're doing, the travel is so slow. Cutting through the growth on the ground, there's animals to contend with, even though it's incredibly moist, and there's lots of moisture in a jungle, the water oftentimes can't be drank. So the risk of dehydration is really high. The jungle that they were in was incredibly mountainous. And so in addition to just navigating a jungle, you're dealing with pretty significant elevation changes. I mean, it is a treacherous place to be navigating, absolutely treacherous. And for them to have moved 5 miles through dense jungle it's incredible. That is almost unbelievable. But nonetheless, their backpack is found, 5 miles away. In addition, the woman who found the backpack, she was a local woman, and she said, I'm out in this area a fair amount, and I've not seen this backpack. I saw it today, and I picked it up and reported it. But it just means that the backpack probably had not been sitting there for very long. It had been probably placed there within the past couple of days, let's say, which doesn't really provide that much clarity, but it adds to the kind of intrigue around what actually happened. So the backpack was in great condition, and everything inside the backpack was very neatly kind of placed. It looked like someone had very intentionally placed everything in the bag, zipped it up neatly, and put it down by the riverside to be found. It didn't have the look and feel of a backpack belonging to two missing people in the Panamanian jungle that's been missing for the past 3 months. It looked like it had just been grabbed off a shelf, put some stuff in it, and put down. But either way, inside there was, there's sunglasses, there was a water bottle, there was some underwear that was in there, and their digital camera was in there, which is going to be really important. And both of their phones were in there, another really important part of this investigation. So when the initial search was conducted, it was done with a focus on the volcano area, because that's the last place the girls had been, at least as far as everybody understood. But now that they found this backpack 5 miles away, they had a new area to search. And so they start searching around the area around the backpack, and they quickly find some of the girls' clothing neatly folded on the side of a river, but no sign of the girls. And then another 2 months go by, and they finally locate, in the same rough area that the clothes and the backpack were found, they actually discover some of the remains of the girls. That DNA confirms it was them. But it's the state that the remains were found in, and some of the other things that were found in conjunction with these remains that raise a lot of questions. So of the remains that were found, DNA proved that some of them were Chris Kremers and Lisa Froon. DNA also showed that mixed in with some of the bone fragments and pieces of remains that were found were at least 3 other people's remains. So we're talking about 5 people's remains in the same area. Also, interestingly, scientists were able to look at the bones, and there were no scratches on the bones. So that's important if you think about it, because their bones were found all over the place. They had been, broken apart, right? Well, if an animal had been responsible, there would have been scratches all over the bones, because they would have broken the bones that way. Without those scratches, the only other way it could happen is if they've basically been pulverized, basically broken with blunt force. So obviously something horrible has happened to these 2 girls, but their remains really only show investigators that the women had died. It doesn't show how they died or really anything. And so investigators needed to look at the other evidence to try to get a better sense of what actually happened. And so they look at the phone records, and they can tell that on April 1st, when they started this hike initially, there is a string of distress calls that are sent within an hour of the hike starting. So whatever happened to these girls happened almost immediately on their hike. None of those calls connect. Over the course of those first 4 days, as they're trying to reach help via their cell phone, nothing's connecting, and then Froon's phone dies. Kremer's phone does not, and they or she begin turning it off and then turning it on sporadically to try to get reception. On April 6th, something interesting starts to happen. Somebody was trying to access Kremer's phone. There was multiple failed login attempts, and it got to the point where you weren't even allowed to input any more codes. It was just locked, the phone locked. So somebody was unable to get into the phone. From April 7th to April 10th, there were 77 calls attempted, distress calls attempted. And then on April 11th, the phone died, and that was it. So in addition to the phone, they started looking at the camera. And so when you look at all the pictures they took, the beginning of the camera roll is this wonderful, montage of these 2 girls having this great time hiking up this volcano. And then as night begins to fall, you can tell that their expressions begin to change a little bit. It looks like you could begin to see that maybe something was wrong. Perhaps they're lost. We don't really know. But then there's no more pictures taken until April 8th. 90 pictures, over 90 pictures are taken between April 8th and April 10th, which is that period of time where all those distress calls were made on Kremer's phone before Kremer's phone finally died. The pictures are very strange. There's a lot of theories about why they took the pictures they did, but in a nutshell, it's the pictures, none of them include pictures of the girls, with the exception of one, which is the back of Kremer's head, and it appears to be bleeding. The rest are shots of the landscape, and they're all taken in total darkness. So they're in the middle of the jungle in total darkness taking these pictures. There was one picture that looked like whatever gear they had been kind of lined up on a rock, and someone had taken a picture of it. There were pictures of candy wrappers, and there also was a picture that was like looking down into a ravine that perhaps was a picture of one of the girls down in the ravine. So it's unclear who's taking the pictures. It could be the girls, could be one of the girls, could be a third party, we don't know. And then there's a ton of speculation about one picture in particular. So picture 509, as it's been dubbed, because that was the number on the camera roll, was deleted from the camera. Now, that in and of itself is not particularly strange. It's not crazy to think that these girls might have deleted a picture, right? I mean, maybe they accidentally snapshot something and they just deleted it. But it was permanently deleted, right? So if you hit delete on a digital camera, it's deleted. But a professional with the right software could reconstruct that image if they plugged it into a computer. Now, in order to permanently remove it from your camera, the girls would have had to connect it to a laptop, to a computer, and wipe it that way. They didn't have access to a computer. So at most, they might have hit delete, but it still would have had that kind of archived, almost ghost image that a professional investigator could have reconstructed. But when they went to do that with this deleted image, it was wiped for good. So someone had managed to professionally wipe one picture. It was the last picture on the camera roll. So the pervading theory here is that these girls got lost and fell to their death. But to me, that's totally unsatisfactory. I believe they were murdered. And I think it's because there's just too many things indicating that foul play was involved. How did they go 5 miles across incredibly rugged terrain that even amongst Navy SEALs, that would be a very difficult distance to cover, even with all the right equipment? How did they, without the right equipment, not knowing the area, without a guide, without even flashlights, how did they do that? And then let's just assume they managed to go the 5 miles, okay? They fall to their death. Why are their remains, one, incomplete, and two, scattered and mixed in with other people's remains? Why were Kremer's bones bleached? And why weren't there scratch marks on the bones? I mean, you would think that in order for if they've fallen off this cliff, let's say, in order for their remains to be scattered all over the place and be dismembered, that an animal would have to be involved if there's no foul play involved. And there's no scratch marks on the bones, so an animal couldn't have done it. So there's lots of questions that go unanswered. And then if you look at those pictures again, it seems an awful lot like somebody else was taking those pictures. Somebody was trying to access Kremer's phone towards the end there, and someone looks like they were using their camera as well. And then, the backpack that was found, it just seems like it was kind of staged. But then again, like, to what end? Why were they giving away the camera and the phone, which kind of led them to thinking probably this is foul play? Why would they have placed the backpack? That doesn't really exonerate anybody. It actually just adds more questions about the case. So the whole thing is just very confusing, but the narrative that they simply got lost and fell, to me, seems like the most far-fetched thing out of all the theories. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. I'll be doing these at least once a week. I'd love it as well if you dropped in the comments suggestions for future videos. And also, please, if you want to message me, hit me up on Instagram. My handle is JohnBAllen416. Also, please follow me on TikTok. That's MrBallen on TikTok. And so that's going to do it, guys. Let me know what you think happened in the comments. Thanks.
magic, cold sweat skin, I feel it coming. In the lantern glow, your eyes will chill. You came looking for truth, but you just found trouble. Your memories are cracking, and I'm chewing through the rubble. Future sight, I don't think I can save you in time. Ruined city in the moonlight, sentinel of the night.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening